I didn't know a room could glitter and rot at the same time. The ballroom at the Fairmont had been dressed like the inside of a snow globe, slow, white flakes circling in the projector lights, a copper band crooning "Have Yourself a Merry Little Christmas," centerpieces of glass icicles and gardenias on every table. Men wore tuxedos that fit like apologies. Women wore gowns that fit like decisions. It was December 18th, and I had decided to keep my wedding ring on. Grant didn't. He swung into the ballroom at 9, sharp with a woman on his arm, 26 brunette, dangerous in the way of a candle near silk. The silver name card on her clutch read Ava. His secretary, the one I'd heard about in fragments and ellipses, the one he'd assured me was a bit intense, but brilliant with calendars. He didn't look at me, he looked through me. Or worse, he looked at me the way you throw a switch. Conversation slowed. The COO's eyebrows rose. The interns whispered. Somewhere in the back, 3 sales reps realized they'd just won the gossip lottery and fanned out like paparazzi. Grant guided Ava forward, stopped directly in front of me, and let his smile bloom. It was the smile he used in pitches, when he thought the deal had already been closed, and all that remained was the theater. Ellie, he said, my nickname from college, weaponized. You remember Ava, she's my date tonight. I waited for the punchline like you wait for thunder. The band slid into a new song. The room changed shape, a subtle tightening as if the chandeliers had leaned closer to listen. Of course, I said. She's brilliant with calendars. Any 10 never offer perfect. Ava flushed, then straightened. She was composed and taut as if some invisible thread were pulled tight through her jaw. Not the villain I'd expected, just a young woman convinced she'd chosen the winning team. I glanced at her wrist. A thin gold bracelet trembled. Grant leaned in. You didn't RSVP as +1, he said quietly. Figured you'd prefer space. The sentence was a perfect little machine, plausible deniability welded to cruelty. I prefer facts, I said, and stepped aside. He laughed too loudly. The people behind him laughed 2 beats after obedient citizens of a small empire. He offered Ava his arm again, and for a moment I saw it. The story he was scripting in real time. The estranged wife, the bold boss, the beautiful protégé. All of it staged at the Christmas party so he could pretend a personal betrayal was just a change in casting. He wanted me humiliated in public so he didn't have to feel guilty in private. That was the first fact. The second fact I learned at 9:22 p.m. when the bartender with the sharp bob slid me my club soda and murmured, "He told her you were separated, not divorced. Separated." The word that keeps everything foggy. The word that lets a man argue that light and dark aren't opposites, merely moods. The third fact followed at 9:41 p.m. when the cellist from the band took her break, came to the bar for a lemon water, and said, "Are you Eleanor? I'm Maris. My aunt works in HR." You should know they moved Ava from temp to salaried on Tuesday with a special bonus. She made quotes with her fingers, apologetic and kind. By 10 o'clock, I had a dozen facts, and each was another bead on a string tied to the same conclusion. Grant had rewritten our life and scheduled the announcement like a product launch. At 10:15, the CFO, a careful man named Klein, with rimless glasses and a habit of inhaling before he spoke, cleared his throat near my shoulder. "If you're ready to leave, I'm happy to call a car," he offered softly. "Thank you," I said, "but I drove, and I'm fine." He studied my face. "I believe you," he said after a moment, and walked away with a small, respectful bow of the head, the kind people give at funerals and revolutions. I watched Grant glide from conversation to conversation. He had always been a collector of attentions, curating them the way a florist chooses dramatic blooms. He looked invincible in that tux, the kind of invincible that makes men reckless, the arrogance of someone who believes nothing will catch up. I rubbed my thumb over the band of my ring and felt the engraving on the inside. At last, we are home. He'd said that when we signed the mortgage and slept on the bare floor the first night, new paint in the air. He'd said it again when we'd brought home the rescue greyhound, shy and elegant as a ballerina. Home, he liked to say, is a decision you keep making. So I decided something. I didn't confront him. I didn't throw a drink. I didn't cry in the coat room or drive to my sister's apartment and collapse into a maze of blankets. Instead, I made a list on the blank back of the dinner menu. 48 hours. What can you do, Ellie? What can you prove? And who is not afraid of him? I underlined that last question twice. The first call I made, standing in the marble bathroom with its faint smell of gardenias and lemon cleanser, was to Priya. Priya had been my roommate freshman year and had loved me well ever since. Practical, surgical, loyal in the way of people who dislike performative kindness and prefer the kind with receipts. She had gone to law school and now handled corporate compliance, like a woman who enjoys puzzles more than parties. "Okay," she said after I told her the situation in a voice so steady it surprised even me. "First, breathe. Second, no theatrics at work events good. Third, what do you want? Options," I said, "and safety." "That's actually two sides of the same coin," she replied. "Listen, any hint of quid pro quo or harassment tied to employment status is blood in the water for a compliance investigation. The company will protect itself, not him. Do you have evidence?" "I have breadcrumbs. I'll bake the loaf tonight." "Good. Document everything. Photos of the two of them at the event, timestamps, witnesses if they're willing. Pull any public-facing posts. Collect expense report anomalies if you can get them. And Ellie? Yeah? Don't call Ava a homewrecker. Don't give anyone the script he wants. Center the policy, not the pain." "Center the policy," I repeated, and felt my spine lengthen. When I left the bathroom, I didn't go back to my table. I moved like a quiet comet through the ballroom, gathering gravity. I spoke to the bartender, her name was Beth, and asked if she'd be willing to write a short statement later about what she'd heard. She nodded. I asked the photographer if I could purchase a copy of every photo with Grant and Ava in it. "We don't usually do all site," he started, then saw my face and said, "Of course." I chatted with the cellist Maris, who gave me her aunt's email in HR. I drifted near the VP of operations and made bland conversation about holiday travel until he said, too loudly, "It's a brave new world, huh?" I smiled, took a sip of club soda, and said, "Brave is free. New is expensive." He blinked, confused, and I knew he'd remember the exchange later, differently, in a way that would help me. At 11:05, just before dessert, I met Ava's eyes briefly across the room. She looked away immediately, but the movement was too quick, too brittle. I recognized something there, how the ground feels just before it gives way. I didn't approach her. Not yet. I left at 11:30, signed the photographer's receipt, and drove home with the radio off. The winter night felt clean and mathematical. I wanted my plan to feel that way too. The thing about a marriage is that it's also an archive. I had passwords, histories, old texts, joint accounts, a printer older than 3 apartment leases. I had the last 8 years mapped in calendar tags and categorizations because I am a person who files her life when it hurts, who alphabetizes pain until it feels like information. From midnight to 3, I built a timeline. I found the first odd charge in April. 2 tickets to a gallery that hosted quarterly curators' salons, events that skewed age 25 to 30, and liked to pretend they didn't. In May, there were 3 Uber rides from the office to a boutique hotel near the river and back, each tagged client cocktails. In June, a jewelry store charge for engraving. And then in August, a flurry of activity. Flowers, a weekend in Montreal, a set of Venmo payments to AM, peppered with bland emojis. I printed everything. I highlighted. I took screenshots and saved them in a folder titled Hearth. Because the opposite of a hearth is a cold room you pretend is warm. At 3, I took a break to cry exactly once. It was efficient and unpretty. Then I washed my face, made tea, and called a second person. "Ellie?" The voice emerged from a desert of sleep, low and wary. "Is this an emergency?" "Hi, Aunt Mo," I said softly. "It's an emergency that wants to become a strategy." My Aunt Maureen had been a union organizer in the 80s, a school principal in the 90s, and a gardener every year thereafter. People underestimated her because they misunderstood serenity for softness. She also happened to be on the board of a small nonprofit that shared 3 directors with Grant's company and 1 major donor. "Tell me everything," she said, fully awake in a heartbeat. By dawn, I had 3 emails drafted. 1 to HR, Maris's aunt, one to the general counsel, an acquaintance from a fundraising gala we'd attended last year, and one to the independent board member everyone respected precisely because he seemed to enjoy saying no more than yes. Each email was factual, unemotional, attached with exhibits. Each closed with 2 sentences that Priya suggested word for word. I am making these disclosures to protect the company and its employees. I ask for written confirmation that no retaliation will occur. At 7:12 a.m., before hitting send, I put my ring in its velvet box. At 7:13, I sent the emails. At 7:17, I texted Priya, launched. At 7:19, she texted back, I'll shadow the inbox. Expect a polite freakout by noon. I showered, dressed in a charcoal suit I'd bought for a conference that had been canceled during the pandemic, and tied my hair back. I looked like a woman who had misplaced her tolerance and found her leverage. Then I went to work my own job, not his, because revenge without routine is just chaos in couture. By noon, the polite freakout had begun. A courteous email arrived from HR, then another from counsel requesting a brief, confidential conversation. My aunt texted, Board member R very interested. Be poised. The photographer sent a link to the party gallery. I bought them all. At 12:40, an unknown number rang. I didn't answer. It rang again. Still no. Priya texted, he's calling you because legal called him. Don't pick up. Written record only. At 1:10, I received an email from Grant with the subject line, we should talk. The body was as concise as a contract. Your email to HR was unwise. Let's discuss this at home tonight, without involving outsiders. I replied at 1:14, happy to discuss at any time in the presence of counsel. Written communications only, please. At 1:16, 3 dots appeared and then disappeared. I pictured him stabbing at his screen, then deciding a lawyer should do it. He'd never understood that silence is a tool you can learn to hold. At 2, HR scheduled a meeting for 9 a.m. the next morning, with me, HR, legal, and critically without him. Priya texted, they're triaging. Good. Collect witness statements tonight. Keep it human and precise. Human and precise. I loved those words side by side. They felt like a prayer and a blueprint. At 5:30, after work, I drove not home but to a quiet coffee shop 3 blocks from Grant's office. I'd texted Beth, the bartender, and Maris, the cellist, and asked if we could talk. Both came, both spoke gently, both signed statements summarizing exactly what they'd said the night before. They didn't embellish. They didn't vilify. They simply told the truth in ink. As we wrapped, Maris hesitated. Can I tell you one more thing? She asked. The band saw Ava leave the ballroom for a long time. When she came back, her eyes were red. If anyone suggests this was a grand romance, it didn't look like that. Beth nodded. She looked like someone trying to hold it together so she wouldn't lose something she'd already lost. I thanked them, paid for their pastries, and stepped out into the cold. The sky had that pale blue that looks like possibility held at arm's length. At 6:40 p.m., as I walked toward my car, a woman stood up from the bench beside it. Ava. She was wearing a camel coat and no makeup. She looked smaller in the world than she had in the ballroom, less polished, more real. I stopped a careful distance away. Ellie, she said, may I talk to you? I considered that she'd waited in the cold for what could not be a comfortable conversation. I considered that the last thing she deserved was the script he'd handed her. Yes, I said. 5 minutes. I didn't know you were going to be there, she started. He told me you preferred not to attend. He said you were moving on, and you believed him. He's my boss, she swallowed. I wanted to believe him. Do you still? The question trembled in the air between us. She took a breath. He said you and he were separated, that it was amicable, that HR knew. When we got to the party and people looked at us the way they did, I asked him if there was something I should know. He laughed. He said, the worst kind of charity is telling the truth to people who can't afford it. I went cold, Ava continued, voice low. I'm not naive, but I'm not cruel either. I'm not in love with him. I'm in debt. My mother's medical bills, my student loans. He made it sound like he could help. Not if I slept with him, just if I were loyal. And were you? At work, yes. I typed until my hands cramped. I kept his calendar like a chessboard. But he didn't want loyalty. He wanted a weather vane that pointed to him. She looked at me, jaw squared. He wants me to take the fall when this all goes wrong. It is going wrong, I said gently. I know. She pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket, hands shaking. These are copies of expense reports he told me to file. Extras he asked me to add after he lost receipts. And a record of 3 meetings he had labeled with a client's name, except I checked. And the client CEO was in Europe those days, posting photos from the Alps. Why are you giving this to me? Because it's right. And because I'd like to be the kind of person who doesn't spend the rest of her career collecting apologies from men who never learned to mean them. She hesitated. Also, I made a backup of some calendar entries. If I give them to legal, they'll say I stole company property. If I give them to you, maybe it's whistleblowing adjacent? You should give them to legal, I said. But you should do it in a way that protects you. I thought of Priya. I can connect you with counsel who'll structure it correctly. And Ava? I softened my voice. Thank you. It is explainling, she nodded, tears threatening but stubbornly unshed. I'm sorry for participating in your humiliation. Then don't participate anymore, I said. Take back your part. She exhaled, a white cloud in the cold, then walked away, shoulders set. I watched her until the corner took her out of sight. It was 48 hours minus 15, and I had enough. The meeting the next morning began on time, which was the first kindness. HR had a conference room prepared with tissues and water, which I ignored. Legal had a note taker. I had a folder tabbed like a small city. We appreciate you coming in, the general counsel began. He was a compact man with a voice that suggested he won arguments by making other people feel ridiculous for having them. We want to understand fully. We have your email and attachments. I'd like the record to show, I said calmly, that my purpose here is to protect the company and its employees from misconduct that appears to include conflicts of interest, improper use of company funds, retaliation risk, and potential harassment connected to employment status. The note-taker's pen flew. HR nodded. Legal didn't. Please proceed, he said. I built the story with facts. I showed the photos, not as scandal, but as timeline. I laid out the expense discrepancies with the patience of a librarian who will wait forever for you to find the right shelf. I presented Ava's expense copies without naming my source, obtained from internal records, and the calendar anomalies as a pattern of mislabeling. I read Beth's and Maris's statements into the record. I quoted Priya's preferred phrasing and watched Legal's pen pause when I said, "The power dynamic is inextricable from the behavior." He was presentimeded it. HR asked careful questions. Legal asked barbed ones. I answered the careful ones and defanged the barbed ones by repeating them back as if we were revising them together. At the end, HR folded her hands. Thank you, Eleanor. We will review this thoroughly. You will receive written confirmation of next steps. I'd like to add one more thing, I said. I'm not asking you to ruin anyone. I'm asking you to enforce the standards you already claim to hold. If you do that, the result will follow itself home. Legal's eyes flickered. Surprise? Maybe respect? As I stood to leave, HR said, "We will need to interview Miss M. Would you be willing to share contact information?" "I believe she'll be contacting you," I said. Soon. When I stepped into the hallway, my phone buzzed. Priya, board member R has called an executive session. Noon. Brace. And then there was a text from an unknown number. Is there any way to speak privately? Ava. I wrote back, yes. But the best privacy is a record. Email HR now. Keep it factual. I'll connect you with counsel to ensure whistleblower protections apply. 3 bubbles appeared. Then, thank you. I felt the axis of something tilt. Noon arrived like a curtain drop. Board member R was a man who wore navy like a creed and had a face both bland and trustworthy. He introduced himself gently and asked if I had 10 minutes before the board went into closed session. We sat in a small side office that smelled of paper and quiet. I've read the materials, he said. 2 things. First, I'm sorry. Second, thank you. You're welcome, I said, because I am no longer allergic to being thanked for doing what is difficult. Our job is to keep the company honest, he continued. It's never pretty work. Miss M just emailed HR with corroboration. It aligns with your timeline. He exhaled. The legal exposure here is non-trivial, I imagine. The board will review. In the meantime, we are asking your husband to step back from his role pending investigation. He won't like that. He doesn't have to. He has to comply. R stood. You won't be in the session, but you should know, whatever happens, it won't be theater. Good, I said. Theater was last night. He smiled small. Winter sun, warm and left. I went home and waited. At 3:42 p.m., my phone exploded. First, a text from Grant. What did you do? Not a question, just a flare. Then a second. This is an overreaction. You have no idea how the business works. Then a third. Sent 15 seconds later as if his thumb had outrun his brain. You will ruin me out of spite. I didn't respond. He sent 5 more texts, each bending grammar like pewter under heat. I blocked his number and then unblocked it because I wanted the record. He called twice. I declined. He emailed angry, then pleading, then performative. I archived each message under a label titled simply Weather. At 5:10 p.m., the company sent a communication to senior staff. Effective immediately, Grant L. will be taking a leave of absence pending an internal review. Day-to-day operations will be overseen by the executive committee. Within 2 minutes, the memo was on social media. Within 4, someone had sent it to me with the caption, "You?" and a popcorn emoji. I didn't respond to that either. Instead, I made soup, fed the greyhound, lit a candle, and waited for the adrenaline to realize it could safely dissolve. At 7:30 p.m., the doorbell rang. It was Ava, flanked by a woman in a navy suit. Miss Rao, she introduced herself. Counsel. Miss M. Thought it wise that we come together. I invited them in. The navy-suited lawyer spoke with crisp kindness. We've filed her disclosures under the appropriate policy. She'll be protected. And my job? Ava asked. Voice so small my plant leaves leaned forward to hear. Do I still have one? That's for HR, Miss Rao said. But whistleblowers are shielded from retaliation. She glanced at me. And there's a chance the board will realize the company would benefit from people who are brave and competent. Ava cried then, brief and clean, wiping tears with the sleeve of her coat. I was so stupid, she whispered. You were young, I said. And he was practiced. I wish I could fix what he did to you. You just did, I said. Maybe not for me, but for the next person. Will you be okay? She asked. I will be honest, I said, and I will be free. That is okay enough. They left with promises to update me. I stood in the doorway and watched the night settle, like a cat on the fence of our little street. Behind me, the house hummed. Home, I thought, not a decision you keep making, but a truth you build by refusing to abandon yourself. People imagine revenge is a single gesture, a dramatic reveal, a slammed door, a car peeling away into the future. Sometimes it is, but sometimes revenge is an ecosystem, a network of small, correct acts that add up to a different weather pattern. The next morning, 48 hours after the party, almost to the minute, the company announced an emergency all hands. The executive committee's chair, an exacting woman named Yelena, who had always tarred Grant because she never laughed at his jokes, stood on the stage with HR and legal. She did not smile. We are conducting a comprehensive review, she said, voice steady. We will follow our policies and the law. This will protect our people and our business. We ask that you refrain from speculation. Facts will guide us, not rumors. She didn't say his name. She didn't have to. By afternoon, the board had appointed an interim COO. Not Ava, not me. A woman from supply chain who had spent 20 years doing work people only notice when it fails. She made 3 swift moves: froze discretionary budgets, paused executive bonuses pending audit, and instituted a policy that required 2 approvals for any calendar entry that involved a hotel. Grant's friends whispered that the company was overcorrecting. Quietly, revenue projections ticked up. The sales team, spared the whiplash of erratic leadership, made their quarter for the first time in a year. At home, I contacted a divorce attorney recommended by Priya's mentor. He was a kind man with a fondness for chess, who explained terms and leverage like opening gambits and endgames. You have more than you think, he told me. You have time, information, and the truth. That's most of the board. We filed. The ring stayed in its velvet box. I labeled the box Artifacts. It felt less sad than it sounds. The first week of January, HR called Ava into a meeting and offered her a transfer, a role in operations, same pay, new team, new mentor. She accepted. On her first day, she sent me a photo of her desk plant, 2 bright green leaves unfurling, captioned, "Clean slate." The investigation dragged on, the way investigations do, slowly, then suddenly. In late January, the board concluded its review. The memo was 3 pages of sober prose culminating in a single sentence of steel. Grant L is terminated for cause. The list of causes read like a shrunken biography, misuse of funds, conflicts of interest, policy violations, attempted interference with an internal investigation. He texted me once more that night from a new number. You win. I didn't reply, because it wasn't a game. Instead, I opened the back door and let the winter in. The air smelled like something honest, cold and new and indifferent to anyone's narrative. Revenge stories often end with a head held high on courthouse steps or a dramatic speech delivered into a microphone. Mine ends in a grocery store aisle. It's a Tuesday in February. I am buying lemons and dish soap and a tin of anchovies because grief has turned me into a person who cooks complicated pasta when she is healing. My phone buzzes. It's an email from the interim COO. Board approved an employee integrity fund. Anonymous reporting, legal support, counseling. Ava will help us build it. If you have thoughts, we'd value them. The email is brief, plain, exactly the right size. I put 2 more lemons in the cart. I think of Beth handing me my club soda in a storm of chandeliers. Of Maris's aunt in HR, careful and exact. Of Priya, who invented steadiness for me when I needed it. Of Aunt Mo, whose serenity turned out to be strategy in disguise. Of R saying no at exactly the right time. Of Yelena, quiet and immovable as a mountain. Of Miss Rao in Navy, pointing her client toward a better future like a lighthouse. Of Ava, who chose to be the person she wanted to be, not the person a man's hunger wanted her to become. The cashier asks how I am. I tell her the truth. I am rebuilding, I say. She smiles and says, "That's a good season." At home, I cook with the windows cracked and the radio low. I set the table for 1.5. The Greyhound gets a little pasta, without anchovies. When I eat, I don't think of the ballroom anymore. I think of a different room, the conference room where policies mattered, the office where Yelena spoke without theater, the new desk where Ava's plant is learning how to be alive in fluorescent winter. Sometimes revenge is simply this: refusing the humiliation someone offered you, returning it wrapped in policy and sunlight, and then building what they could never imagine because they never learned to love anything they couldn't perform. 48 hours after he tried to make me small, I'd made the circle around him big enough that he couldn't pretend it wasn't there. 48 hours after he walked into a room with a woman on his arm like a trophy he could tax deduct, I walked out of that same room with a plan that didn't require raising my voice. And 48 days later, when the divorce papers were almost ready and the company felt steadier than it had in years, I took a long, slow walk in the thin winter sunlight and realized the most exquisite act of revenge is not revenge at all. It is the disciplined, daily work of becoming a person whose life is too honest to humiliate. A person who knows the difference between spectacle and change. A person who can look at a glittering, rotting room and decide, no, I will not live in places that reward cruelty. At last, we are home. I thought not in a house or a company, but in the weather of my own choosing. I washed the pasta pot. I blew out the candle. I left the ring in its box, and the box in a drawer I never opened. Then I went to bed in a room that smelled like lemon and winter, closed my eyes, and slept a sleep so deep I dreamed of summer.